Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday, where we, by we I mean a tiny handful of fugitive booktubers, attempt to get you to pull down poetry off your shelves, read it to us, and talk about it a little. Poetry is egregiously overlooked, even in our little corner of BookTube, which loves all kinds of things. I try to do this. The only reason that I ever skip a Poetry Thursday is because, as is endemic to people who work at home, I sometimes forget what day of the week it is. But I have a poem today. It's a little different than usual. I also read what I consider to be a terrific poem in my hideously long other video today from the New Yorker. So I'll do a normal booktuber thing and urge you to go and check out that video. And make sure to hit like and subscribe and hit the bell for future notifications. And now a word from Surfshark. I'm going this time around, this Thursday, to one of the greatest poetry anthologies of them all, the Oxford Book of English Verse. This is not, with all apologies to Rumpole, the Quiller Couch edition, and this is instead the Helen Garner edition, which is much better. Plain and simple, it's just an improvement on Quiller Couch. But I had this forever and ever in a naked hardcover with just memories of what the dust jacket was like, and I told myself the Brattle will provide. Eventually, you will find a mint condition, perfect edition of this version of the Oxford Book of English Verse with the Joshua Lawrence cover. And I did. Eventually, I did. And I want to read you a poem today from 1770. It's by Oliver Goldsmith. A lot of you, if you know that name at all, will not know this author as a poet. You will know him as the author of a beloved novel. What was once a beloved novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. I don't think The Vicar of Wakefield is known or taught anymore, so maybe you don't know Oliver Goldsmith at all. He was a delightful person. He was tiny, but he was a hottie. And like a lot of people who grew up with Irish descent, he was kind of poor with money. Not poor in the sense of not being generous, but poor in the sense of being generous. Whenever he got money, it went through his hands to something else. Here's a project I can certainly subscribe my widow's mite. Here's a friend who needs 20 pounds. And although I also need 20 pounds, I happen to have 20 pounds. Better to go to them than go to me. That sort of thing. But he was also a talented poet. And in his own day, in addition to the Vicar of Wakefield, which a number of literary figures in his day, including Samuel Johnson, knew Oliver Goldsmith had a genuine talent. And I think a lot of them sensed that he probably wasn't long for the world. He died fairly young. They wanted to get as much work out of him as they could. But in addition to that book, he was also known for his poetry, including one particular long poem called The Deserted Village, which was meant to write about endemic evils that he saw encroaching on what he considered to be the idyllic, beautiful, pastoral past of rural England and rural Ireland. Rural Ireland is where he grew up. Westmeath, particularly in the Midlands. He wanted to draw attention to what he viewed as the evils of what we would call wealth disparity, the evils of enclosure, which was a big deal at the time, where suddenly your landlord, the Earl of whatever, 2 towns over, who owns all of the land in a 300 square mile radius, decides that a big patch of ground that had been in common use for 1,000 years, that he was going to enclose that land. Not literally put a wall around it, but that it was suddenly going to be for his use alone and no longer for common use. So if you were pasturing your livestock on that land, you no longer could. Or if you could, you had to pay. If you had, for instance, a little crofter's cabin on that property, you had to get out. You can't live on his property anymore. He has uses for it of his own. If you were drawing wood from those woods, you have to stop, or you're a poacher. If you were drawing animals, if you were hunting animals in those woods, you have to stop, or you're a poacher. Maybe you can get a license to do that, but it'll cost you money. It's not free anymore. If you're fishing in those streams, or even drawing water from those streams, no, not anymore. That's what the law of enclosure at its heart was. And Goldsmith wasn't the only person who saw that as an evil. I myself don't see a large part of the evil in that. But Goldsmith took pen to paper in order to write about what was being lost. And in his poet's mind, I'm not saying that he was lying. We'll get to that. In his poet's mind, what was being lost was Eden. And in The Deserted Village, he tries to describe that Eden before he describes its loss. And that's what we're getting in this poem. The part that Helen Garner includes in the Oxford Book of English Verse is one part of The Deserted Village. So it's not the whole thing. But it's so beautiful to read. It's such an example of what I talk about how a poem should have scansion, it should have structure, it should have verbal virtuosity. It shouldn't just be stacked words. It's such a good example of that I want to read it, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Goldsmith is doing in this poem. It's a little bit longer than stuff I usually read on Poetry Thursday, but apparently it's a day for long videos, so this won't be long either. You'll get through it really quickly. This is the section of the deserted village called Sweet Auburn, and Auburn is the name of the hyper-idealized English country village or Irish country village, the country village that Goldsmith sees as endangered by this hyperinflation and by the law of enclosures and all that sort of thing. Auburn was one of the names of one of the little towns that he did grow up in, or grow up near, and was very familiar with it. The locals called a version of this town the Pigeons. Oh, do you live in the Pigeons? But the Irish, what are you going to do with them? but Sweet Auburn is the name of this section, and it goes like this. Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where health and plenty cheered the laboring swain. Swain is a young man. It's going to come up again. That's the only reason I mentioned it. Where smiling spring with earliest visit paid, and parting summer's lingering blooms delayed. Dear lovely bowers of innocence and ease, seats of my youth, when every sport could please. How often I've loitered o'er thy green, where humble happiness endeared each scene. How often have I paused on every charm, the sheltered cot, the cultivated farm, the never-failing brook, the busy mill, the decent church that topped the neighboring hill, the hawthorn bush with seats beneath the shade, for talking age and whispering lovers made. How often have I blessed the coming day, when toil remitting lent its turn to play, and all the village train from labor free led up their sports beneath the spreading tree, while many a pastime circled in the shade, the young contending as the old surveyed, and many a gambol frolicked o'er the ground, and sleights of art and feats of strength went round. And still as each repeated pleasure tired, succeeding sports the mirthful band inspired. The dancing pair that simply sought renown by holding out to tire each other down. The swain, mistrustless of his smuttered face, while secret laughter tittered round the place. The bashful virgin's sidelong looks of love, the matron's glance that would those looks reprove. These were thy charms, sweet village, sports like these, with sweet succession taught each toil to please. These round thy bowers their cheerful influence shed. These were thy charms, but all these charms are fled. Sweet smiling village, loveliest of the lawn, thy sports are fled, and all thy charms withdrawn. Amidst thy bowers the tyrant's hand is seen, the desolation saddens all thy green. One only master grasps the whole domain, and half a tillage stints thy smiling plain. No more thy glassy brook reflects the day, but choked with sedges works its weedy way. Along thy glades a solitary guest, the hollow-sounding bittern, guards its nest. Amidst thy desert walks the lapwing flies, and tires their echoes with unvaried cries. Sunk are thy bowers in shapeless ruin all, and the long grass o'ertops the mouldering wall. And trembling, shrinking from the spoiler's hand, far, far away thy children leave the land. Ill fares the land, to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath has made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. About the mechanics of the poem, it's almost perfect. This is heroic couplets as they are done just beautifully, where your own breathing dictates the pace of this thing, where the poem is so perfectly matched to the way iambic pentameter works in spoken English that you scarcely notice. The rhyme scheme is mapped to your speaking, and then it elevates the map. It's gloriously beautiful. There is a problem. I know that in heroic couplets, that marrying of what was it? The bashful virgin's sidelong looks of love, the matron's glance that would those looks reprove. Even in Goldsmith's day, most people said reprove as reprove, so those don't rhyme. And I know that anything that ends with OVE is considered okay. It's a reach, but it's considered permissible in heroic couplets, but I don't like it at all. End rhyme should have rhyme, and you could rework that so that it did. But even so, apart from that tiny little smidge, this is pretty much perfect. Augustan era prose is pretty much perfect, and shows this is not easy to do. It might sound easy, but the only reason it sounds easy to do is because it is perfectly matched to your in and out breathing. It's perfectly matched to the da 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 da. It's perfectly matched to iambic pentameter. It's perfectly designed that way. So it looks easy. It reads naturally to the mind. But is it true? Is it true? Now, we don't ask for poetry to be true, right? Even on Poetry Thursday, maybe especially on Poetry Thursday, we don't ask for it to be true. But there's a case being made here. It's not just this is lovely. It's lovely, but is it true? And it turns out that this isn't true on any level. The loveliest village of the plain, all of that nonsense that goes on for 2/3 of the poem, the part of the poem that I read, is, like I mentioned, it's an idealized portrait of rural life in England and Ireland at the time when Goldsmith was vaguely remembering his childhood. And he was remembering his childhood through rose-tinted glasses, the way childhood is meant to be remembered. This kind of rural existence was never actually fact. Notice all the stuff that isn't here. The poor, the desperation, the dirt. The one mention that we have of dirt is a swain, of course, who's the swain mistrustless of his smutted face. It's a very good phrasing, mistrustless. In other words, trusting. But notice that because the individual feet of the line also have to be upheld as well as the end rhyme, trusting won't work. And instead of abandoning the whole conceit or the whole idea and writing something else for this couplet, Goldsmith comes up with mistrustless. That's wonderful. That's absolutely brilliant. But that's as close as we come to the filth, to the degradation, to the desperation of rural life in England and especially Ireland at the time when this poem was written. And also there's the fact that the owners of those humble little crofter cabins, the ones that are so elevated in this poem, the people that Goldsmith knew quite well, that his father knew quite well, they themselves would be infuriated if you walked up to them and said, well, I know you use this section of your back lot here for growing cabbages, but I'm taking it. I'm going to take that slot from you because I want to build a bird bath there. So you don't get to use that for cabbages anymore. Any one of the people invoked in this poem, or that Goldsmith knew, would have been infuriated at that. And yet somehow that is okay if you're doing it to a landowner and saying, well, you've got this vast 1 mile square patch of your property that we use. We don't pay you anything for it. It's not ours, but we use it and we've used it for generations. My grandfather used it, so you don't get to use it for the way you want. We're using it. Goldsmith, in the reverse of that scenario, would have been the first to object. But in this poem, no. Also, I want to point out that a lot of we don't need to get into the weeds of the politics of the day. But if you read something about the evils of enclosure, you might want to read the fine print, because a lot of the stuff that's written about the evils of enclosure and rural depopulation of rural England and rural Ireland at the time is simply false. We have parish registers. We have parish rolls. We know perfectly well how many people lived in these places at every given year. Most of them experienced no catastrophic depopulation, especially due to what we would call hyper-capitalism. There were, of course, villages in Ireland that were severely depopulated by the Irish potato famine. Yes, of course, yes, there were there, including the places that sent the few scattered remnants of the Powers, Hickeys, and Donoghue family to America, and the Leahys as well, but we don't talk about them. Well, not only are those figures largely fudged a lot of the time, I'll read sober histories of the Ireland of Goldsmith's day that are simply factually wrong. They're just building on other claims. That this whole idea that what was that line? And trembling, shrinking from the spoiler's hand, far, far away, thy children leave the land. That is a myth. And there's a lot of mythology going on in this poem. I think that's what gives it a lot of its incantatory power. But I want to mention one more thing that is actually wrong about it. Now, keep in mind, we don't ask our poems to be right. But this one is making a world description. It's making what we would call in the 21st century a number of truth claims, and they're all wrong. And the last of those truth claims that's wrong here is that there was any kind of a despoilment of Westmeath. This simply isn't true. I've walked over every inch of the Midlands, and they were unbelievably gorgeous in Goldsmith's day. They were unbelievably gorgeous 100 years after his day. They were unbelievably gorgeous 200 years after his day, and they're still unbelievably gorgeous. They never underwent, what was it again? Now thy glassy brook reflects the day, but choked with sedges works its weedy way. So the fact that a landlord wants to build a new mansion is killing the streams. Along thy glades, a solitary guest, the hollow-sounding bittern guards its nest. No, there were robins and jays and all sorts of other things living in those hedges, and they still did. They did right through. It wasn't ever that Sauron invaded. What was it again? Amidst thy desert walks the lapwing flies, and tires their echoes with their unvaried cries. So, in other words, Goldsmith is saying not only has the broad breadth of bird life disappeared, but even the lapwing can't be bothered to vary up their routine. It's just one cry over and over again. None of that happened. None of that happened. It's a beautiful place to walk around in, and it's not hiding long-held bitter scars. It was always beautiful to walk around in. This is actually, The Deserted Village just in general in 1770 is a long poetic polemic. And polemics get to muck around with the facts. That's a defining characteristic of that breed of writing. And it can happen in poetry too. But wasn't the poem wonderful? The way it invokes this beautiful lost Eden and the change in register, which is not just, I know I changed my voice when I was reading the change in register, but it also happens in the wording too. The change in register from that happy, wonderful moment, that wonderful, all those sports happening on the greensward, to the haunt of the bittern and the lapwing. That's all just beautifully done. Just beautifully done. Which I guess means that our Oxford Book of English Verse Poetry Thursday lesson for today is that if you come across a collected volume of the poetry of Goldsmith, and you think maybe you had an English degree training, and so you know Goldsmith's name for The Vicar of Wakefield, and you think, I didn't even know this guy wrote poetry, give it a try. It's actually quite good. And the broader lesson here, which has nothing to do with poetry, so it feels a little turncoaty to do, is that if you haven't read The Vicar of Wakefield, do so. Okay? It is a great book in English canon. Whether it's taught in English language programs or not, it is a great book. So, and it's Goldsmith's foremost claim to fame. That and a beautiful statue. But that is your Poetry Thursday for today. It's Sweet Auburn, and it's from The Deserted Village. I wasn't going to read you the whole of The Deserted Village. But we'll be back next Thursday. I plan on never missing a Poetry Thursday. We'll be back, and who knows what we'll find on Poetry Thursday. And be sure to look around in your subscriptions and even a subject search on YouTube for Poetry Thursday today. Be sure to look for that. The few BookTube channels that are doing this are well worth listening to. It's a free, like so many good parts of BookTube, it's a free education. I've been loving it. I've loved watching these videos. I've learned so much from them. But anyway, we're going to wrap this up for now. The bean wants to go outside, and the rain has pulled away, so I think we can manage that. So we're going to do that. We're going to go on a walk and chat to each other for the whole of that hour, and it's not going to have any English, and it's not going to have any books, it's not going to have any kind of human stuff in it at all. We're going to chat about things that you don't even perceive. The million conversation starters in a 2-day-old piece of squirrel scat. You don't even know that it's scat, and if someone pointed out to you that it was, you wouldn't even be able to smell it at all if you held it in your hand, much less smell anything different about it. Anything interesting about it. I'm going to put away the Oxford Book of English Verse and slip into that world, which is mercifully free of feet and rhythm and scansion. But I will be back. I will be back. I actually love both worlds. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.